Hello, everyone, and welcome to week number 6 of the course. I promise I'll make this video a little bit shorter than some of the videos we had in previous weeks, but I just want to prepare this video this week just to give you a really brief overview of some of the theorists and theories that we talk about in this week 6 of the course. And as you know, throughout the preceding weeks, we have introduced different schools of thought and different theories and kind of taking you through a chronological journey of the public organization theory literature. So this week, we're going to wrap up our presentation of new theories and theorists with kind of what I consider to be our more modern organization theories. And all I really want to highlight is I want to highlight to you a couple of schools of thought. One, the school of thought of quality management. Secondly, the school of thought of organization culture. And then introduce you very briefly to what the organization theory literature says about leadership. And we'll talk about charismatic and transformational and transactional leadership. And then we'll conclude our brief discussion with a view into what we think about leadership today and how we tend to view leadership in public organizations today. So Tompkins takes you through this pretty protracted discussion of the School of Quality Management. And I'm not going to be nearly as in-depth as Tompkins is, primarily because I think quality management, while it has been applied in the public sector, really has some limited applicability, especially in comparison to some of the other theories and schools of thought that we have talked about in the past. As Tompkins tells you about quality management, he takes you through the development of quality management, talks to you about statistical process control, total quality control, and some of the early innovations in quality management. The basic idea behind quality management, obviously, is that we will create outputs, we'll create programs and goods and services that are uniform in their quality, that they all have the same level of quality for our consumers, for our beneficiaries. One of the primary drivers of the quality management school was Deming, and there's a lot of discussion of Deming in the Tompkins textbook. Deming kind of had a two-stage career, in that the first stage of his career of promoting quality management was relatively unsuccessful, because he really did struggle to get any type of traction in America with quality management. Not a lot of public corporations and private corporations in America, not a lot of public organizations in America were very interested in this idea of quality management. So what Deming did is he took his theories to Japan, and he found a very willing and ready audience in Japan for his theories. His theories of quality management took hold in Japan. American corporations then started taking note of the quality products that were being created by Japanese corporations. And then there was a rush to embrace Deming and embrace quality management in the US. When quality management came back to the US, it came back primarily in the form of things like TQM, or total quality management. Your organization may have gone through a period of implementing TQM, so you may have some firsthand knowledge with TQM. But essentially what TQM is it is a consumer or customer-driven process, where what we do in the production process is dependent upon what customers and what consumers need. So it's a very customer-focused and oriented way of managing the processes within our organizations. Total quality management is supposed to be predicated upon total employee involvement, so that all of your employees are involved and really buy into this whole process of building quality into the process of creating our outputs. It is process-centered, and so what we want to do is build quality into all those activities that go into the process of creating the product. And then if you build quality into the process, then in turn you will end up creating a quality output as a result of that quality process. Integration of functions. TQM really focuses on integrating the functions of all the different employees who are involved in that quality-driven process of creating the product. It's a very systematic process, and it's also a strategic process. So we identify the goals that we are trying to achieve, as we produce these products and these goods and these services. TQM is also based upon a continuous feedback loop for continuous improvement. So we're always taking what we learn and feeding that information back into the production process. So it's a continuous improvement and continuous learning type of cycle. The decisions that we make in this quality process are all fact-based decisions, and it's predicated upon an open system of communication, so all employees can voice their concerns about any lack of quality in the process, so those concerns can then be addressed. Concerns of consumers are then taken into account as well, and then fed back through that feedback loop into the process of producing that good or that service. And that's what's referred to as total quality management, or TQM. And when we saw quality management be embodied within public organizations, we typically saw it embodied within this TQM type of an approach. Likewise, another author that's associated with the Quality Management School is Giron. And Giron introduces us to this total quality process, total quality control process, as a three-step process. First, we have to plan quality into what we are building and what we are creating. Then in the process itself, we have to build quality into the process itself to control the process, to make sure that we have a quality process that produces a quality output. And then you always have to have that feedback loop of continuous improvement so that you can always improve your production process, which then ostensibly in turn will improve the quality of the output that you are creating. So it all makes a great deal of sense. It's kind of similar to a few years ago, not that I'm advertising anything, but Ford Motor Company had their slogan, "Quality is job one." And their commercials talked about how they built quality into the process of building a truck, which then emphasized the fact that that truck that was produced from that process would then be a quality type of vehicle. So we've seen it happen in private corporations as well as public organizations. But again, the problem and why we're a little hesitant to buy completely into quality management in the public sector is that there are a lot of problems with trying to apply it to public sector organizations. And the primary issue are all these obstacles that make it difficult to apply quality management to public organizations. I've listed 8 of those problems on the screen there for you, and we'll go through them very, very quickly. Structural fragmentation. We know that public organizations tend to be much more fragmented than their private sector counterparts. The more fragmented the organization, the more difficult it is to have a cohesive and coherent quality process in place. There are lack of incentives. Quality management in the private sector is oftentimes predicated upon pay for performance. So if a unit is creating a quality output, the members of that unit will be financially compensated for that quality output. We know in the public sector, we don't have the same types of extrinsic incentives that we can provide to employees for creating a quality output. So we just don't have the same tools the private sector does. We tend to have a high turnover in leadership. If you think about agencies and departments, especially at the federal level, they are all led by political appointees. You know, whenever a new administration comes in, those political appointees turn over, and the new administration will appoint their own political appointees to run those organizations. So within a matter of 2 to 4 years, you may have a complete turnover in the leadership in a public organization. So it's kind of hard to keep the momentum going towards something like quality management. Statutory barriers. We are told how we will implement policies and programs in the public sector. All that language comes to us from the enabling legislation. So we have statutory limitations on what we can do in the production process. So sometimes we can't do the types of things that we would need to do under a quality management approach in the private sector. Quality management means giving up power, giving up decision-making responsibility to those who are involved in the production process. Total quality management, and really the quality management school itself, is really predicated on proximity to production. So those who are in close proximity to production should be the ones who are participating in those discussions about how to build quality into the process. In total quality management, you oftentimes have what we call quality circles, and you'll create a quality circle made up of those employees who all have a hand in the production of this good or this service. Well, as an upper level manager, that means if you're creating these quality circles and allowing these quality circles to self-determine how the production process will go, then as a manager, you are giving up a lot of that power, and there's resistance to giving up that type of power to employees. It's a lack of resources. We oftentimes don't have the money that we need to enhance the quality of the production process. We may be able to identify, well, here are some additional things we can do to make the production process of a higher quality. But if it means hiring new employees, or it means paying people more, we lack the resources to be able to do that in a lot of public organizations. Conflicting goals, because again, we serve many masters in the public sector. It's difficult for us to have a clear, well operationalized goal of what we are trying to achieve, and to then have everybody agree to that goal. And then finally, the lack of performance measures. As we know, one of the main differences between public and private organizations is how we measure performance. The types of products that are being created in the private sector are clearly much easier to measure because they tend to be a lot more empirical and quantitative than the types of products that are being created in public sector organizations. So we just lack those performance measures that our private sector counterparts tend to have. So while quality management, I think, is a viable school of thought, it is relatively limited in the ability of applying it to the public sector and our public organizations. So that's one school of thought. We saw primarily in the 50s and 60s, 70s. TQM really started to hit its heyday in the 80s and the 90s. So it is one of those what we consider a more modern type of organization theory, albeit with limitations for how it can be applied to the public sector. This next school of thought, though, is one that I'm a big fan of, and that's organizational culture. And Sheen is the primary theorist that is usually talked about when we talk about organization culture. And we've made mention to this along the way throughout the class, but it's based upon the assumption that every organization has its own unique culture. And by culture, we're talking about its own unique norms and expectations and values and ways of doing things. That's a unique culture, and every organization has its own unique culture. So this school of thought says we want to really understand why an organization is structured the way in which it's structured, or why an organization does what it does. We need to truly understand the unique culture within that organization. Organization culture theory tells us that there are a lot of different ways we can study culture. One way we can study an organization's culture is by studying the artifacts that are created by that organization. So just like if you go on an archaeological dig and you want to learn about an ancient society's culture, you would go on an archaeological dig, you might dig up, eating utensils. You might dig up portraits that they may have created. All those things we consider artifacts because they are tangible indications, tangible representations of how that ancient society functioned and what that ancient society valued, what that ancient society believed in. So those tangible types of things that are created by ancient cultures, we use in archaeology. Well, here in public administration, we know organizations create their own artifacts as well. Organizations create agendas for meetings. They create minutes from meetings held. They create policy manuals. They create procedures. They create rules and regulations. All those things are tangible things that we can analyze in order to understand the unique culture within that organization. So that's probably the easiest way to study an organization's culture, by looking at the artifacts, the tangible things being created by that organization. But then at a deeper level, a second way we can study an organization's culture is by studying espoused values. Espoused values are things such as, the mission statement of the organization, the strategic plan of the organization, the articulation of its goals and its objectives. Those are espoused values. They show us what the organization values, and they're spoken of. I mean, they're provided to us. We can actually go and read the strategic plan and see what that organization values. The third and much more hidden way of studying an organization's culture is through what's called basic assumptions. Now, basic assumptions are much more difficult to see because they're much more intangible. Basic assumptions are the shared values that we have as an organization that we don't speak of. So they're not espoused values, they're values that we all hold dear, but we don't really talk about them. They're unspoken. So, organizations oftentimes will value equity among their employees. They may not talk a lot about it, but hopefully everyone in the organization shares that value. So whether you're looking at artifacts, espoused values, or basic assumptions, those are all ways of studying the unique culture of that organization. Now, organization cultures are oftentimes not just something that organically develop, they're oftentimes promoted by leaders. And so leaders can come into an organization and they can embed their culture within that organization. And we won't go through it, but there are primary and secondary and tertiary methods by which leaders can embed culture into organizations, whether it be things like slogans, whether it be things like paying attention to certain types of behaviors and rewarding or penalizing certain type of employee behaviors. There are a lot of ways leaders can embed culture. And I really commend you to, when you read through the Tompkins textbook, really pay attention, I believe it's on page 367, to that table he provides for us in terms of here are some of the primary versus secondary methods that leaders can use to embed culture in the organization. The upshot of all this is that it really feeds into, again, that it depends type of answer. So how we study an organization, it depends upon the unique culture within that organization. We first must understand that organization's culture before we can then understand why the organization looks the way in which it does and why the organization functions and behaves the way in which it functions and behaves. So again, I love the answer, it depends, and so it's probably why I really like organization culture theory a lot. But I think that's one of your more modern theories that is certainly has dominated a lot of the public organization literature of late. And again, the upshot of all this is it means that we're going to have to take a contextual, contingency-oriented type of approach to studying our public organizations. Gone are the days of looking for that magic bullet, that one-size-fits-all approach. Now we have to develop unique theories and unique models for the unique cultures in each organization we are studying. One type of organization culture that really became very popular a few years ago was Weeche's Theory Z. And Weeche's Theory Z really speaks to a specific type of culture in an organization, a specific type of culture that we saw primarily in Japanese organizations that really has been adopted by a lot of American organizations as well. Weeche's Theory Z is predicated upon things such as lifetime employment for employees. So these employees aren't going to bounce back and forth between organizations. When they join an organization, they're primarily there for a career for a lifetime. There is promotion within the organization, but that promotion is very slow and very gradual. So someone's not going to fly up the organizational chart in 3 to 6 months. It's going to be a long, protracted process to move up through that organization chart. But again, that's someone who's there for a career or a lifetime. So you're really looking at the long game with Theory Z type of culture. It's based upon non-specialized career paths in that we know that we do a lot of specialization of tasks, we do a lot of division of work, but by developing these non-specialized career paths, people have the ability to engage in cross-functional training. They have the ability to, as a human resource management theorist will tell us, develop their own resources and their own abilities and capabilities as a human being. The control mechanisms in a Theory Z type of culture are implicit as opposed to explicit control mechanisms. In the classical school, control mechanisms were very explicit. It was very top-down, very kind of in-your-face type of direction. Here, the direction is much more implicit. It's much more of a persuasion than it is a direction. Everyone takes responsibility for collective decision-making. So the decisions that are made are not made by one person. Everyone takes ownership of that collective decision-making. Everyone takes responsibility, collective responsibility for those decisions. So when a decision doesn't work out, you're not finger pointing, but rather everyone in the organization takes ownership for the result of that decision. And people have holistic concerns. You're not just looking at what benefits you and what will benefit you tomorrow. It's a more holistic look at, we're all in this together. We're all part of this organization for a lifetime. So how can we make the organization better? And that's Uechi's Theory Z. Again, it's a unique type of organization culture that we saw a lot of organizations endeavor to try and adopt, especially in the 90s and a decade ago as well, just to try and implement this as their culture. Again, very similar to what we saw used in a lot of Japanese types of organizations. So that's just one example of what an organization culture can look like. I just want to throw that Theory Z out at you just so you kind of have something to hang your hat on, that we talk about organization culture. Well, what can an organization's culture look like? Well, Theory Z tells us this is what an organization's culture can possibly look like. But that organization culture, again, oftentimes it may kind of generate organically over the years gradually, but oftentimes we see culture affected by leaders. So when new leaders come into the organization, typically they will want to try and embed their own culture into that organization. We talked about leadership previously. In a previous week, you read about autocratic and democratic and laissez-faire leadership and the Iowa studies and Lewin and Leiker and all those great folks. So you're kind of familiar with the finding of Lewin and Leiker that essentially democratic leadership tends to work better than autocratic leadership. Autocratic leadership leads to a lot of resentment. Democratic leadership allows people to kind of think on their own. But there's this precarious balance here. You don't want to be autocratic, but you also don't want to be completely hands-off, because that completely hands-off was what they referred to as laissez-faire leadership. So you didn't want to be autocratic, you didn't want to be laissez-faire. You kind of want to shoot for the middle with democratic leadership, a la a Mary Parker Follett in her approach to creating democratic organizations. So we know some element of democratic leadership oftentimes works well for leaders. But the leadership literature really has gone through an evolution over the past several years. And the evolution has really taken the literature from a trait-based approach to a behaviorist approach to a contingency-based approach. So earlier on, many decades ago, the leadership literature really emphasized a trait-based approach, which argued that there were certain innate traits that people had that made them great leaders. And you're kind of born with leadership skills. But as we continued to research trait-based leadership, we came to the realization that that wasn't really true, that you could teach leadership skills to people. People had the ability to acquire leadership skills and become great leaders. It's not just that they're born great leaders, they can develop into great leaders. So the literature really moved off of this trait-based approach and really moved more into a behavioralist approach to leadership. Two of the primary studies that really got us started on this behavioralist approach, studies from Ohio State and from the University of Michigan. I will point out that the Ohio State studies came first, and I'm not saying anything, but I am going to say that the Michigan studies look a whole lot like the Ohio State studies that were published a couple of years before the Michigan studies. I'll leave that there. But the Ohio State and the Michigan studies both looked at leaders in terms of two dimensions. One dimension were leaders who are very task-oriented, leaders who are very production-oriented. The other dimension were leaders who are much more considerate of their employees. They were much more employee-centered. And so the Ohio State and Michigan studies kind of show us that some leaders are much more task-oriented. Let's get the job done. Let's be productive. Let's be efficient. Other leaders will trade some of that productivity and that efficiency for developing a relationship with their employees and being more considerate of their employees' needs. And this kind of dichotomy of task orientation versus employee consideration orientation really started again with the Ohio State and the Michigan studies, and it still colors a lot of what we see in the current modern leadership literature. Now, when leaders lead, there are several different ways in which they can do it. One approach to leadership is obviously charismatic leadership. So charismatic leaders will lead based upon their personality. So their authority base for a charismatic leader really resides within that individual. The great thing about charismatic leadership is that it engenders a lot of loyalty among followers. So you're going to have some very loyal followers. The disadvantage is obviously that it's transitory, in that whenever a leader leaves the organization, that leader will take their authority basis with them. So the authority basis leaves with the leader. And so you got to start all over again after you have a charismatic leader leave the organization. Followers will not necessarily follow the new leader. So it's a very transient, very transitory type of authority structure in charismatic leadership. Another type of leadership that we see in the leadership literature is transactional leadership. And this is, again, very much of a Chester Barnard type of argument, in that leaders engage in transactions with their followers. So leaders will provide incentives to their followers. If those followers value those incentives enough, those followers will then follow the leader. They will then provide contributions that the leader needs in order to be successful as a leader. Very much a transactional type of relationship. In the political science literature, we would call that type of a leader a broker. And there's a really interesting body of literature that looks at mayors and categorizes different types of big city mayors. And one category is a broker type of mayor. And broker types of mayors are transactional types of leaders. Transactional leaders, broker types of mayors, can keep the trains running on time, as we say in public administration. They can get things done. They can make the organization productive, but they're not very good at articulating a vision or a direction or strategy for the organization. Transformational or visionary leaders are much better at showing the organization, here's the direction we want to go in, and here's how we should move in that direction. Transformational leaders bring a new vision into the organization and then endeavor to spend their political capital to get people to buy into this new vision. Transformational leaders are usually, when they're mayors, they're usually referred to as entrepreneurial mayors. Now, when you're an entrepreneurial, transformational type of leader, in order to be that type of leader and be successful, you're going to burn through some of your capital. Every new leader comes into an organization with a finite amount of political capital that they can then spend. Well, if you're a transactional leader, you don't have to spend a whole lot of your capital. You're just making these bargains and making these, brokering these deals, and you don't have to worry about burning through that capital very quickly. Transformational visionary leaders may burn through their capital quickly, and it's those transformational leaders who really tend to move the organization and really have a lasting impact upon the organization, but they're also the ones who are more likely to move on to other organizations. They burn through all their capital, they start to lose support, and they then move on. City managers, for instance, so entrepreneurial types of city managers tend to have relatively short tenures with their city councils. City managers are hired by city councils and they can be fired by city councils. Well, if you're a transformational type of city manager, you're probably going to end up taking the city eventually in a direction that perhaps the majority of the council will not agree with. And when they know a majority, no longer, you don't have the support of a majority of your council members, you're probably no longer going to be city manager in that city. Transactional city managers, those are the ones who tend to hang around the same city for a career because they don't do anything to tick off their bosses on the city council. Where the literature kind of sits today is more in this contingency type of an approach. At some points in time, you may need to lead in a transactional type of manner. At other points in time, you may be able to be more transformational. So if your organization is facing a lot of challenges from its external environment, like in an open systems type of theory, and your organization has to make a decision very, very quickly and change direction really quickly, you may not have the time to build support for that. So you may just have to engage in a transaction. Well, I need you to do this, and so I'm going to give you this selective incentive to get your immediate agreement so that we can do what we need to do to survive as an organization. So sometimes you have to be transactional. However, sometimes you have less threats from your external environment and you have more time to actually develop a plan and a strategy of where you want to take the organization. In those times, you're probably going to be a little bit more transactional. Sometimes you'll be more production oriented. At other times, you're going to be a little bit more employee consideration type of orientation. So I think the literature today really tells us it depends. Just like everything else, it depends. It depends upon the context and the situation in which we find ourselves. Like Mary Parker Follett told us 100 years ago, we oftentimes lead by situation. And so I had mentioned the Ohio State and Michigan studies, and this box on the screen kind of demonstrates it for you, where you've got two different orientations. You've got your initiating structure, which is your production task orientation on your x-axis. Then on your y-axis, you have consideration for employees, and then you can see the 4 different contingencies in those 4 different boxes. Bottom left, low consideration for employees, low concern about achieving productivity. The opposite of that in the top right-hand corner, high concern for employees as well as a high concern for productivity. So Fiedler then Fiedler and Redden then take this and they apply it to this contingency type of an approach. And so on this next slide, you see William Redden's 4 styles of contingency-based leadership. So in your bottom left, you have laissez-faire leadership. And we know from the Iowa studies that laissez-faire leadership of the 3 was the worst type of leadership. It was even worse than autocratic leadership because absolutely nothing got done. A laissez-faire leader in that situation would feel that in that situation, people are uncontrollable. So as a leader, I'm just going to try and stay out of trouble. I'm going to just protect my back, and I'm just going to kind of take a hands-off type of an approach. That's a low concern for your employees, as well as a low concern for productivity and performance. Above that, in the top left-hand cell, you have a human relations type of leader. Human relations type of leader really focuses on organizational harmony and focuses on the satisfaction of the employees within the organization. Very high concern for employee relationships, very low concern for productivity. Sometimes these human relations leaders are referred to in a pejorative manner, and they're referred to as country club leadership. It's country club leadership because everybody likes coming to work, everybody likes everyone else, everyone gets along, but nothing really gets done. Then in your bottom right-hand cell, you have those autocratic leaders. They rely on authority and very much of a top-down management style with very little employee involvement. Clearly, they have a high concern for productivity and they have a very low concern for people. This would be a type of leadership that you may do if, again, you have to make a decision very, very quickly and you're facing these challenges from your external environment. As we know, the ideal situation is in the top right-hand cell, a democratic leader who tries to combine organization and performance goals to find that point of goal congruence between the goals of the organization and the goals of the individual. A high concern for performance, but also a high concern for people. But again, without making a lot of value judgments here, except for laissez-faire leadership is usually the worst, but beyond making those types of decisions, contingency-based leadership means that you may have to use different styles depending upon the situation in which you find yourself. Sometimes you have to take a more autocratic leader role in order to get the organization through trouble, but then when things calm down, you might be able to then be a little bit more democratic in terms of having concern for both getting the job done as well as concern for the welfare of your employees. I think we would all like to think of ourselves as democratic leaders, but I think there are gradations in between. One of the flaws of the leadership literature is that leadership authors tend to try and force people into boxes, which I think that's endemic in social science research. That's what we do in the social sciences, is we try and categorize people and categorize behaviors. There's an inherent problem with that because there are gradations in between. You may be a little more autocratic in this situation and a little less democratic. Or you might be a little bit more of a human relations leader and a little bit more of an autocratic leader. But I think there are a lot of gradations in between these four categories. We kind of do ourselves a disservice by saying, well, this person's in the top left or top right or bottom left or bottom right-hand cell. There are gradations in between. It's really much more of a spectrum than it is just four discrete categories. But I think the theme to take away from this discussion of the leadership literature is the leadership literature, again, really looks at a contingency basis today. We ask the question, what situation do we find ourselves in? And then we lead in accordance with that situation. Again, the reason why I told you at the very outset of this class that it depends is oftentimes an appropriate answer in organization theory and also an appropriate answer in the study of public administration itself. So hopefully this brief discussion kind of introduces you to quality management theory, organization culture theory, and then where we currently sit today in terms of our approach to studying leadership strategies and leadership styles in the public sector. Okay, now they've taken a tour through quality management, organization culture theories, and leadership. Let's take a look at the assignments here in the course in week 6. One assignment that you have here in week 6 is your outline and references. And so for this outline and references assignment, you will be just providing a very brief outline of your critical assignment paper. And so the major topics and theories that you will be looking at in your paper. We're not looking for complete sentences here. We're not looking for a narrative. This truly is an outline. So you'll give just the basic headings for each of the different sections of your paper. So you should have the first page should be a title page. Second page should just be those headings that you plan on using in your critical assignment paper. And then the third page will be a list of references that you plan on using in that critical assignment paper. There is a video that's provided in the resources for this week on how to create that type of an outline. So watch that video, and that should show you exactly, if you haven't done an outline like this before, exactly what that outline should look like. But again, title page, and then an outline with just a list of the topics that you'll be covering in your paper, and then a reference page. So it's 3 pages, and that's it for your outline and references assignment. So pretty quick and easy. Then you have a journal entry. And for this journal entry, what we're asking you to do is to reflect on organizational leadership and culture, along with the framework for organizational effectiveness. Review the information in Chapter 5 on leadership and organization culture. Relaying this to your own experiences, what types of leadership have you found to work best? What are the pros and cons in your opinion? Feel free to review theories in other chapters, such as McGregor, along with information in Chapter 15, such as Weechi's Theory Z, transactional leadership, transformational leadership, and a lot of those concepts that we had just talked about earlier in this week's video. Review the information in Chapter 15 on organizational culture. How have the theories of Sheen, Singh, and others manifested in organizations and or situations from your work or your personal life? Point to concepts in the textbook or videos that could have further improved the situation. So using examples from your organization to illustrate these concepts from organization culture literature. Review Exhibit 15.3 on page 384 of the textbook. In your own words, explain what the graphic means and provide examples to illustrate those main points. Again, this is a journal entry, so it may be written in first-person language. You don't have to have citations. It's not a research type of assignment. We really want to see your interpretation of some of the theories that are covered this week and your ability to then also use examples from your own experience to illustrate some of those theories. So an outline type of paper, a little 3-page outline, and then a journal entry looking at those types of concepts. And those are the assignments for this week. I think they kind of tie together a lot of the theories that we talked about in this week's video. As always, any questions, feel free to send me an email. Otherwise, I hope everyone has a great week, and I look forward to reading your work.